Well, folks, at the time of this recording in my preferred local time zone, it is Wednesday, August the 27th, which of course means that we've got a fresh new batch of games from everyone's favorite weekly Blitz event on chess.com, and this titled Tuesday was a real doozy. You could say a titled doomsday. Why I'm not a rapper, I don't know. But with so many incredible games to choose from, I almost couldn't decide which to cover first. I had to construct this massive flowchart of pros and cons, which was actually far more complicated than any chess game I've ever tried to analyze. But at the end of the day, I know what you guys want to see first, and that is the one and only Hans Niemann, once and for all, putting Magnus Carlsen in his place, totally breaking his spirit, turning him into his own personal Theon Greyjoy, and then dominating him for the rest of his life. Or falling flat on his face trying, which is actually what happened. You gotta respect his persistence though. Hans Niemann shows no sign that he's ever gonna stop trying to speak into existence with both his mouth and his chess moves his own particular vision for the future of chess. And in the game we're about to look at, he came pretty darn close to getting that process underway. At one point, Magnus Carlsen even had a dead lost position, but there's losing and then there's Magnus losing, which is not quite the same thing, or even close to it. But let's start at the beginning, where in this position, Hans Niemann has Team White, and he kicks off this contest of contentious coexistence with e4. Magnus retorts with a Sicilian defense, the horse bust goes to f3, a knight to c6, a bishop to b5. This is known as the Rossolimo attack. Will Hans capture the knight on c6, damaging the black pawn structure a bit, though leaving his dark squared bishop without a partner, or will he not? Well, after Magnus's reply, g6, we get our answer with bishop takes c6, after which black is faced with a slight dilemma. Do you recapture with the b-pawn, increasing your ability to control the center of the board with pawns, or do you choose Magnus's move, d takes c6, opening lines for both queen and bishop? Magnus has decided to prioritize piece activity, and after d3, activating the dark squared cleric and queen to c7, we have a very interesting move from Hans, e5. And it's one that I don't think I would ever play in this position, despite the fact that it prevents black from developing his knight to its most natural f6 square from whence it could possibly make its way into d5, because what's left in its wake is this quite succulent hole on f5, which Magnus immediately targets with knight to h6, and after Hans castles, does now occupy it with knight to f5. So Magnus is now a bit ahead in development. He's got his knight on a very nice square where it can possibly and will definitely hop into another nice square on d4. But you know who isn't as impressed with black's position as I thought they would be? The computer program Stockfish 17, which is still giving white a slight advantage. Play continues rook to e1, supporting the wayward foot soldier on e5. The knight drops into d4. Hans, of course, does not capture it, as that would allow Magnus to repair his pawn structure with c takes d4, gaining some queenside space. What's played is h3, a good move. We wouldn't want any bishop to g4, pestering and pinning that steed on f3. And now it's Magnus's turn to make an odd decision with his next move, knight takes f3 check. Why would he be so quick to give up his beautifully posted knight while assisting Hans in getting his queen developed with the recapture? All I can say is that Magnus's ways are not our ways, or the ways of the engine, who is now evaluating the position as being nearly a pawn in white's favor. Magnus is now able to execute a one-move threat with bishop to g7, that's always exciting, hitting that e5 pawn a second time, but after Hans's response, bishop to f4, somebody's about to be subjected to a brutal little game of peekaboo. Magnus knows that he can't allow the diabolical discovery with the move e6, so he blocks it with his bishop. Hans now plays a move that is probably not best for some very specific engine-y sorts of reasons that I hesitate to even get into, a4, taking some space, discouraging black from playing b5, but apparently knight to c3 was a bit better, and the reason is that in this position, black can get away with the move g5. Now Magnus didn't play this, but the point is, if you retreat the bishop this away, then black can play h5, and all of a sudden, things are looking pretty pawn-stormy for the white king. So best is probably bishop takes g5, removing the defense of e5, which black can now capture with his bishop. Now if knight to c3 had been played instead of a4, then white could get a crushing advantage with the move queen to h5, threatening bishop takes e7 with a discovered attack on the e5 bishop. Black shouldn't move it, or else there's rook takes bishop on e6, exploiting the pin on the f7 pawn, but what he can do is castle long, after which bishop takes e7 can be met with rook to d5, defending the bishop while setting up the delightfully nasty threat of bishop to h2 check, winning the white queen. This would of course not be possible if white's knight were sitting on c3 when it could simply capture the rook. So there's the express version of why knight to c3 was best. But let's get back to the game, where after a4, Magnus does not find his best reply g5, but rather plays a5, which does have some value, preventing white from expanding further by playing a5 himself. Next is knight to d2, which at this point may or may not be superior to putting the knight on c3, where it would only have the prospect of going to e4, as opposed to having the additional potential to play to c4, as the knight does here. Magnus responds h6, a good move. Maybe he's thinking about g5 next, supported by a pawn. But after Hans Niemann's reply, knight to e4, he forgets all about that, if it was indeed his plan. And if you're thinking it's because he now has the opportunity to grab the e5 pawn with bishop takes e5, well, that's a very sound thought, because this is indeed what Magnus should play. But he does not. Now, was he afraid of bishop takes e5 when after queen takes e5 there is the potential for a discovered attack on his queen once the knight on e4 goes somewhere? Doesn't seem likely, because it is pretty easy to see that the knight really has nowhere very dangerous to go, with the black queen covering all of its forward squares. Was he nervous about the move knight takes c5, sacrificing the bishop on f4 in order to sacrifice the rook on e6, when after f takes e6 and knight takes e6, his queen and bishop would be forked? Who knows? But he shouldn't be worried about it, since after bishop to h2 check, king to h1, and queen to d6 counterattacking the knight, black is a full rook up, for which white has zero compensation. Whatever the case may be, what Magnus plays in the game, in response to knight to e4, is not his best move bishop takes e5, but rather the highly dubious b6, just defending that c5 pawn. This allows Hans to execute a very nice tactic. Take a moment if you wish, and see if you can spot it. What is white's best move in the position? The move is knight to f6 check. Now, if the knight is captured with the bishop, then e takes f6 is very bad, exposing an attack on the black queen, who must keep defending against queen takes c6, which means that after f takes e7, black is going to have to recapture with his king, if at all, losing the right to castle. Not a good thing. Taking with the pawn would be even worse. After e takes f6, again with a discovered attack, with pawn takes bishop on g7 coming next. So Magnus makes the wise decision to just leave that knight alone and just moves his king to f8. Hans responds with a very strong move, knight to e4. The mission has been accomplished. Magnus can no longer castle. Now, if bishop takes e5 is tried in this position, then we're going to have bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, and knight takes c5 with the discovery on the queen. And after queen takes c5, because of the unfortunate placement of black's king on f8, white's going to get his piece back with rook takes e6, exploiting the pin on black's f-pawn to his king with the winning position. Magnus has the good sense to avoid this in the game, where he instead opts for rook to d8. Now the position is starting to get pretty unclear, and probably hopelessly so, unless of course you have access to the engine, which sees everything virtually instantly, and in this position is recommending the move bishop to g3, for the apparent reason that it's good to have the bishop defended by a pawn, so that you can meet bishop takes e5 with knight takes c5 when there's no bishop takes f4 blocking the f file. You could try pawn takes knight, but this drops the bishop on e5. Or you could try bishop takes g3, but this allows the knight to take the bishop on e6, winning the black queen due to the pin on the f7 pawn. So not easy stuff to work out, even for the great Hans Niemann, or the even greater Magnus Carlsen, who after the move played in the game, b3, does not play bishop takes e5, which is now his best move, failing to realize that after bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, knight takes c5, queen takes c5, and rook takes e6, black can play queen takes c2, and now meet rook takes g6, still taking advantage of the pin on the f7 pawn, with rook takes d3, with an apparently dead equal position. For reasons which, if you'd like to try to probe further, have at it. I'm going to get back to the game though, where in response to Niemann's inaccurate move b3, Magnus does not play his best move bishop takes e5, but rather king to g8. Okay, at least he's getting off of the white queen's file, preventing that potential pin on his f7 pawn. Hans responds with a very nice move now, h4. Maybe not the very best in the position. The engine was recommending putting the knight back on f6 with check, but this move is quite sneaky, because if Magnus tries bishop takes e5 here, then we're going to have bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, and knight to g5 defended by a pawn. So there is no queen takes g5. So for example, after queen to f5, knight takes e6, queen takes f3, g takes f3, f takes e6, and rook takes e6, white emerges the big winner. and there are alternative lines that could be explored. Black loses in every one of them, but let's look at what Magnus plays, which is not the utterly losing bishop takes e5, but it's something almost as bad, rook to d5, hitting e5 a third time, though giving Hans Niemann a winning tactical shot. See if you can spot it. The winning move, not played by Hans, is knight to f6 check, forking king and rook, giving black the unpleasant choice of either losing the exchange or taking the knight on f6 with either bishop or pawn. The engine's recommending e takes f6, and after e takes f6 with that discovered attack on the queen, queen to d7 and pawn takes bishop. If the king recaptures, then bishop to e5 will win the exchange, and if rook to h7, then there's just bishop to e5 defending the pawn on g7, and black's pretty much toast, as he is in all the other lines that we're not going to get into. What's played in the game by the formidable Hans Niemann in response to the blunderous rook to d5 is the dubious knight to c3, attacking the rook that way. But this gives Magnus a beautiful opportunity with his very strong response, best move in the position, g5. Now as white, you don't really want to capture on g5, bringing to life black's lurking rook along the h-file towards your king. If knight takes d5, then black has bishop takes d5, hitting the white queen, followed by pawn takes bishop on f4, gaining the two minor pieces for the rook with the winning position. So what's played is bishop to g3. Magnus captures on h4, once again hitting the bishop. We have bishop takes h4, which is just fine. Bishop to f4 was playable as well, although it would have given Magnus an interesting opportunity to sack the exchange with rook takes e5, when after bishop takes rook and bishop takes bishop, black would be more than compensated with his powerful bishop duo bearing down on white's king side along with his extra pawn. But here, Magnus can and now does play rook takes e5 without giving up the exchange, since after bishop to g3, he's got rook takes e1 check, rook takes e1, and now queen to d7, getting out of the view of the bishop on g3, which Hans now puts on e5. We have a trade of bishops, queen to d4, which looks like it wins a piece, attacking both knight and rook. However, Hans has foreseen that he's got queen to g3 with check defending the rook, when after king to h7, he's now able to get his knight out of danger by moving it to either e2 or e4. But which square is better? What would you play in this position? The correct move is knight to e2, but Hans now commits a massive blunder with knight to e4. So what's so wrong with this? Well, Magnus is about to show us with his powerful winning response, rook to g8, hitting the white queen. Now if the knight were on e2, then white could just respond knight takes queen and win the game. But here, white has to either move his attacked queen, or he could try c3, counterattacking black's queen, and then lose to rook takes g3, pawn takes queen, and then rook takes pawn on d3. We're not going to go any further down that gopher hole. What's played in the game is not queen to h2, as that would run into queen to a1 checkmate, but rather the only reasonable alternative that keeps the rook on e5 defended by the queen, and that is queen to f4. But now comes rook to g4, bringing into focus a major problem with having this knight sitting on e4, as it prevents Hans from defending his rook with the move queen to e3, which unfortunately for him means that there is no way to keep defending the rook without losing his queen, and for that reason, in this position, he now resigns the game. c3 counterattacking black's queen is still not working for various reasons, the simplest of which just might be queen takes d3, when after something like queen to f3, queen to b1 check, king to h2, rook to h4 check, king to g3, and queen to h1 threatening checkmate in 1 on h2, white's got to give his king a square, but after, let's say, queen to d3, here's just one of several winning lines, rook to h3 check, g takes h3, queen takes h3 check, king to f4, and queen takes queen on d3. So not this week, Hans. There's always next Tuesday. Gotta respect the effort though. He did find some very nice moves in this one, luring Magnus into some quite murky middle game waters, inducing some errors by both sides, the final and most egregious of which just happened to be committed by Hans Niemann, resulting in his very rapid demise. So I thank you for joining me here today. Consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed the video. Hit that like button if you like chess. Leave a comment with anything that's on your mind, and I will see you soon.